and a former colleague. I'm excited to chat with him more about the product development process, and also he's led a lot of some of my favorite products at Adobe. Aubrey, you want to go ahead and take a minute to introduce yourself, and we'll get into some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. Really a pleasure. Always love our conversations. Yeah, I'm Aubrey Cattell. As Joe said, I lead product at Adobe. I tend to work on the new stuff, the 0 to 1 projects. So I've been at Adobe about a decade. I spent the first 6 years building Adobe Express as the original VP and GM there, which is really a design app for non-designers and a big focus for Adobe. We've always had amazing apps like Photoshop and Premiere Pro and InDesign and Illustrator, but we're really taking a lot of that technology and democratizing, creativity, really helping visual communicators stand out on social, with presentations, and now even with print capabilities. But a couple of years ago, Express was getting bigger, and I was looking for the next thing. And I took over the developer platform, which has been really exciting. What my team does now is, we basically run the App Store. So if people are building add-ons or plugins for Adobe applications, my team provides the platform for that. We're also taking Adobe's creative and now generative AI superpowers and embedding that in other applications. The idea being, we want to go where our users are. A lot of them come to us already at Adobe and to our applications, but some of them are on other platforms, and so we want to be able to integrate there. So that's been what I've been doing the last couple of years, and we'll chat a little bit today about product development and marketing and growth, and I'll share some anecdotes along the way.
Awesome. Yeah, one thing I've always loved about our chats and kind of like the role that you have is, and I believe that you coined this with me before, is just that startup within the enterprise. I think it's such a cool aspect and opportunity. Walk us through kind of your product development process. How do you take an idea from conception to launch and really kind of hone in on finding the market?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think a lot of it is one of my favorite mantras is stay in the customer problem space longer, right? A lot of teams, there's pressure to deliver. And so you want to start building the solution, and then you end up falling in love with that solution instead of really focusing on the customer, right? Supporting that with user research, with experience designs early on so that you can play with a paper prototype, and even building engineering prototypes to see how something's going to work. And I think, if you can do that and spend more time there, I think you get closer to that customer problem and that core set of needs. And then, you can build a solution that can be responsive, but also more differentiated in the market. Because part of that discovery process with customers is understanding the other alternatives that are out there. And what I always try to look for is, where and how can we differentiate with the products that we're building? Some things are just table stakes and, ultimately not defensible in the long term. But if it's something new that hasn't been in market before, then that matters. And then obviously, more durable differentiation is really the key. And that's what's great about kind of incubating the startup inside of the bigger tech company. If you do it right, you can take advantage of, the capabilities that exist, the customer base that exists, and you can provide more value. So, when you think about Adobe Express, a product that we built, we really pushed on mixed media editing because that was where customers' needs were. They wanted more expressive content for social platforms like Instagram. So we were able to do things like leverage the power of Photoshop, as well as video capabilities from the Premiere Pro team, and bring those to web and mobile, which is something that Adobe hadn't done before. That also meant we needed to think about the platform's capabilities and the UX. So for example, how do you take a much simpler approach to layers where you can just drag or drop layers versus, work with the panel in Photoshop? Or, how do you simplify timeline-based video editing? And in terms of our process, we tested internally at Adobe and then externally with users until we got it right. And now Express is a key growth engine for Creative Cloud and for Adobe. We just launched Express for Enterprise, which is a big push now. That it works for individual users. We can start to address the needs of broader teams.
That's awesome. You mentioned kind of obviously the launch of a product and how you do internal alpha, beta testing, you involve customers for feedback. How do you incorporate those customer insights along the way, not just for like obviously 0 to 1 launch, but
Yep.
when you have a mature product and you're trying to figure out the roadmap and like what actually matters and mixing the customer qualitative data with the usage data, how do you kind of pull that all together?
I think you nailed it right there at the end. I mean, I'm a huge believer in quant and qual customer insights. And too often you have teams that favor one or the other, right? Like you got a super data centric team that's, deep in the dashboards and looking at the numbers. And that'll tell you what is happening, but it won't tell you why. For that, you need the qual research and really talking to customers and understanding. Now, there's other teams who aren't looking at the numbers and are too focused on what customers are saying. And sometimes, customers say one thing but do something else. And so you need the what and the why, the quant and the qual to make it work. And so, I'd talk about my current team, the developer platform team, and how we approach product extensibility. We take a pretty broad-based approach because ultimately we're managing a two-sided platform. We have developers who create experiences, but then we have end users who consume those experiences within our products or on other surfaces, but it's an embedded solution. And so how do we do that? Well, we look at amplitude data and we're constantly scouring that for end user usage and patterns. We're also monitoring our developer site and understanding what our partners and developers are utilizing in terms of our tool set. But then we have qual on top of that. So, for example, we hold office hours with our developer base, and we do NPS pulse surveys to understand, is the developer experience, where it needs to be, or how do we improve? And then we go really deep with things like end user research, right? So we will take solutions that we built or things that are in development, but we'll also look at just more broad-based problem areas that we want to go deeper on. We also do that with developers. So I launched a couple of years ago our Voice of the Developer series. So and I invite different folks from my team, but I try to spend an hour every other week with one developer in our platform and really just talk about like, hey, how'd you get into this? Tell me about your business. How do you spend your day? What things are you building? Are you building on our platform? Are you building on other platforms as well? What does that look like? And those are some of my favorite conversations. And I'll share, an example insight that comes out of this process. So when you think about Adobe Express, the app that we were talking about, my team now supports that from a platform standpoint. And we have a number of storage add-ons that are kind of key to business use cases. So, we integrate with Dropbox, with Google Drive, with OneDrive. And we were promoting those contextually in the app, because if you're going to make something like a social post or a presentation, you need to pull in your content, and a lot of your content is stored in those other solutions. But what the data showed us was, users were using those storage add-ons, but they were really keen on content add-ons. So they wanted things like, well, where do I find additional images or design assets or 3D models, right? I mean, additional kinds of typography, which is crazy because Express has so much content built into it. It's kind of a content-first application. And so we dug into that more, and what we learned was that there was this huge demand for just additional expressiveness. People wanted building blocks. Users wanted building blocks to create stuff. So we started promoting those content add-ons in the Express Media panel so that the discovery of them was very contextual, right? You're going there looking at the built-in content. Oh, here's additional add-ons that you can go to find that content. And then on the developer side, we started offering product grants to developers via the Adobe Fund for Design, which my team manages, to say, if you're going to build these kinds of add-ons, we've got grants for you to help fund your development process. So the innovation there that was driven by the customer feedback was really on both the supply side and the demand side in terms of pushing on both.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's so important to get that information and pull the teams together. And Zide is all about a collaboration tool, bringing things together and making communication easier. You're leading the product side. You guys have all this great information. then you have to figure out how to collaborate and figure out how the dev team pulls it in, how the marketing team pulls it in. How do you kind of work across teams and actually like put together, okay, here's what our roadmap is. How do we market this? How do we get customers to actually use these things?
Yeah. Well, that's the core process, right? And I love that you included marketing in that group. So let's come back to that because I think that's a key piece. You know, I always start with the product triad, right? Management, design, and engineering. So I'm a big believer in the Marty Kagan school of thought, you know, who wrote books like Inspired. So for me, you know, product management focuses on what's the right product, right? Like what ultimately are we building here, you know, based on that understanding of the customer problem space. And then you have engineering who focuses on, okay, how do we build that product the right way, right? And kind of planning for what we're trying to get out the door now, but for also, you know, how does that scale over time? How do we ensure the right level of performance, reliability? And then design is part of that process because you have to think in terms of, but what's the optimal customer experience, right? And ideally, you're thinking about that end to end. So done right, there is inherent collaboration there across PM and engineering and design. There's also healthy tension in that setup, and I think that's good, right? I mean, here's where I can't stress it enough: those three functions have to work together from the beginning, right? When engineering assesses feasibility or scalability beyond the initial cycle, or design is brought in after the product's already defined to figure out the experience, it's always a mess. And so they have to work together. And then marketing fits into the picture because, and you know this, Joe, because this is your world. Ideally, they're both inbound and outbound, right? So the inbound means they're customer centric as well, and they stay in that problem space that I mentioned. But the outbound means they think in terms of the cross-channel marketing, but they're doing it in a way that that focuses on the customer and up levels from just the features and capabilities of the product to the benefits and ideally the emotional appeal of a product, right? And that's where the magic is, you know, can you get to that higher level, which is, you know, what is the zen of this product? Like, why does it matter? And so, you know, what I find is that helping those functions define their swim lanes, stay within them, and know when and why to cross over. That's the biggest part of what I do as a product leader and a GM. And frankly, it's both the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity, because if you get the best ideas from all of those teams and they're really working in concert, then, you know, ultimately you're delighting customers.
So you've come up with, let's say you come up with a tier 1 release. It's going to go out at Adobe Max, which is, you know, how Adobe loves to release their big products. What's your go-to-market strategy? How do you kind of pull in those collaboration strategies you mentioned and really get a team together to be like, hey, this is a hard deadline. This is how we work back and hit it.
Yeah. And I mean, I have deep empathy for, you know, the folks who are leading that go-to-market charge, because in my experience, you know, marketing is almost always under-resourced and asked to do too much too late in the game. So how do you get ahead of that? I think, you know, for me, and I've learned this the hard way too many times, the biggest consideration is just a lack of focus, right? Like, who's the target customer? And in turn, what are the relative benefits and emotional appeal? And what does that mean in terms of what are the right channels to yield the highest ROI? Because you can do anything you want, but you can't do everything. And if you don't have that focus, it's not going to work out. So, and what I see too often is the lack of alignment here means product is building one thing and marketing is trying to tell a different story, right? Like, that's the biggest problem. So, you know, we've done that well is like with Express, we pinpointed social media marketing as our early focus, and we emphasize, you know, speed and expressiveness and a fun UI and UX as key benefits. Now, that was really the core of the product, but you know, were we fully ready to address the needs of teams at that time? We weren't, right? Did we have a solution that worked really well in the classroom? We weren't there yet either. And so, you know, trying to address those markets ahead of where we were with the product, that was significant. That was a big challenge. Now we're in a different place today, and that's great. But it's alignment between marketing and product teams around us, that zen, that focus on the customer, on, you know, the solution and the right channels, and then it's building for that. And you know, the other thing I'll say is in terms of go to market, because yeah, I mean, we love our big marketing moments. You know, Max it's a fantastic event, and it's a showcase for our customers, and they all come together. But the other thing I always remind my teams is marketing can only do so much, right? Like when a product team is like, why aren't you marketing this feature? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, they're not going to focus on this feature. They're trying to tell a higher level storyline. So what and as a product team, we have a lot more power than we think. So what do we need to do? Two things: nail product market fit and invest in product led growth, right? And these are kind of the real keys that I think product teams need to embrace, right? Like I think back to the early days of Express when it was still Adobe Spark. I had my team delay product features that would add value to the product, because with a small team, I wanted to take resources and stand up a cross-functional growth squad, which was the first growth squad at Adobe, that could help new users discover value. And a great example that's still paying dividends today is we invested in intent-based SEO. So what does that mean? Well, Adobe's always done well with branded terms, right? Search for Photoshop, search for Premiere Pro, search for, InDesign. All roads lead to adobe.com, no problem. But Adobe wasn't really investing, because we didn't have a lot of web-based solutions that could pay off the way Express can. We weren't investing in intent-based search, things like, make a flyer, make a poster, make an Instagram post. And so my team invested in, landing pages to address those keywords, both, focused on the use case as well as focused on, a set of templates. And when users would click on those pages, we would deep link them into the editor with, all they'd have to do is just, sign in, and they'd immediately be creating with the starting point that we gave them. And that, we got, at one point, our traffic was about a third of adobe.com's total traffic, just on the back of that intent-based motion that we stood up within 12 months. And so, I can share other anecdotes like that, but that's where product teams, they have more power than they think if they're willing to invest in growth. And that's even more powerful if they can do that together with their marketing partners, who probably see opportunities there if they have product resources to put at it.
No, that's awesome. I think that's such a great example of a challenge in product and like managing a roadmap. Is like, you do have to, like, what I see as a consumer is what you release at max. And that's like, a very small portion of your roadmap. I don't see like all the bug fixes, all the stability focus, all the like UX changes.
Yep.
Like, how do you kind of balance that innovation of bringing in these cool new features that, yeah, you release at max and everyone gets stoked about, with like the growth stuff behind the scenes, the making sure people actually use these features, that type of thing?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge, and it's funny what you say, right? I remember in business school and marketing, I think that to have recall around a brand, you need to be exposed to it 30 times.
Yeah.
And like, when you think about like toothpaste and the commercials that you see on TV, or at least you used to back when you and I were younger, it's these products that are largely comparable to each other that spend the most money on advertising, right? Think how many insurance commercials we see now on YouTube or in other contexts. And so you gotta figure out how you can both acquire as well as drive successful adoption of your product with the product itself, right? And this is why, like, there's this push around how do you drive virality, or how do you find the swimming holes where your users congregate and spend time there. I found that some of the toughest trade-offs I've had to make were definitely around building new value versus driving growth so the users can discover that value. And I think that's a tough one that every new initiative faces. We're in a different place with Express now, where we can invest in both at a much larger scale, but it still requires tough trade-offs. And I think the other part of that I've definitely made mistakes around are also investing the right amount in performance and reliability, right? In the early days of Express, we did not have the snappiness that we needed for a lot of features, and it's always hard to figure out like how much impact that has on your product. But users are not super patient for things that operate slowly. And I think when you're building for the web, you have to be cognizant that seconds matter, milliseconds even matter. And so how do you strike that balance as well? I don't have any silver bullets other than I think a big part of it is it's an area where engineering really should exert itself in terms of the customer experience, right? Like at the end of the day, very few product managers are like, and I want you to spend, this much of your, bandwidth on ensuring performance and stability and reliability. Engineers have to advocate for, how are we going to build this in a scalable way? How are we going to ensure that the performance is going to meet the demands of this customer base? And, there's a lot of things, that can be done there, both from a white box and a black box QA standpoint, but, automating testing, right? Like testing on different devices with different internet speeds. I find that, with different connections from a bandwidth standpoint, I find that really has made a difference in terms of how we understand how well our products perform. And not enough teams need the right devices, and they need the right way to simulate different environments so that it can understand, like, well, 50% of our users are going to experience this, but 20% are going to experience this, and that's tough. And what's that trade-off look like? But that's all the detail you got to get into.
My foundation for this type of thing is Mark Garrett. When Adobe was shifting from box products to SaaS, I got to be a part of that ride, and we were having all hands, like, I don't know, monthly. Like, it felt like it was monthly, and Mark was up there, former CFO of Adobe, and our stock was, tanking. But like subscriptions were going way up, and he's like, just like hang in there, like stay the course, like we're really confident, the street is talking about this. So I think at some point too, it's just like you have to make those bets, and hopefully it pays off. Like with Zeit, my first time around here, we focused like 3 quarters on stability, and because the product was kind of buggy and people were complaining that it would crash. And now it's super stable. It was very painful to like show that to our board and be like, hey, we're kind of just stable on growth, but like, the product's better and it's going to pay off. And it has paid off. But yeah, you do kind of have to make some of those big bets, like you said. And that's.
Well, and I love that you give 2 examples. I mean, that's incredible conviction, right? I mean, Adobe knew that. We saw early on that move from perpetual license to subscription, while there was going to be this massive trough, was ultimately going to expand the addressable market, and it's paid off in spades. And I think, taking the time to, invest in stability, or even re-platform in a way that's going to drive not only, performance and stability, but probably developer velocity. Those are tough trade-offs to make, but ultimately what's needed if you're going to be successful. And you gotta have the patience. Big bets rarely pay off overnight, right? Like, or we all know them, right? And so that kind of patience is so tough, like to manage with your stakeholders, with your board, right? With your customers, even with your employee base. And it really like means, spelling out what's this future going to look like, and why is it worth, investing to get there.
I want to combine our last kind of 2 questions here, because I think they're fairly in line with each other. So it's competitive landscape. There's always new startups entering and exiting. There's always big companies making acquisitions. You have the behemoths like Adobe and Microsoft and Salesforce always trying to one-up each other. How do you combine the competitive side with like future trends, where you see things coming? Everything's all about AI right now. But how do you kind of keep in line with parity with your competitors, but also like stay ahead of them at the same time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I always think there's kind of 3 areas that you have to look at in terms of innovation, right? One is you got to stay close to your customers, right? I mean, they're not static any more than your product is. And so you have to understand, where and how are their needs being met in certain areas, but where are new needs appearing, right? And what are those unmet needs, whether they can articulate them or they can't, right? And a lot of times they're going to say, well, I need this solution, but you dig in more and it turns out like that's not actually what they wanted. Then, you have to be aware of the competition. I think that, there's always this, I think Bezos said it, right? You want to be customer obsessed, but competitor aware. When that shifts to obsession over the competitor, I think you're in an unhealthy place. And so, but you have to be abreast of, how where they're investing, how their solution is solving needs, where, and there are different ways to kind of look around the corner. One of the tricks that I always love is where your competitor's hiring, right? Like go check out where their open job listings are. It's always
Yeah.
an insight into, what's next for them. And then the third area is, what does the technology make possible, right? That, the competitors may or not even be thinking about, and certainly your customers aren't going to ask for, but really is there in terms of a paradigmatic shift. And you referenced it, it's the one everybody's thinking about right now. Generative AI, certainly is a game changer across a multitude of industries. And creativity is first and foremost among them, right? I mean, what we have Adobe Firefly, and I mean, I think some of the things that we've already showcased are incredible. It's also, I think we are differentiated there because Firefly is designed to be commercially safe, because we're training, on our own Adobe stock data, or things that are, are fully within the public domain, and that's different than a lot of others are doing. We want to be safe for business in terms of what we're doing. And we also have an amazing opportunity to integrate generative AI into our existing products, right? I mean, it's one thing to be able to generate an image. It's a very different thing to be able to use like generative fill in the context of Photoshop, right? And I mean, if you tuned into the last Adobe Max, we led off with, power users of Photoshop who were just going crazy over, the innovations that we've been able to ship in Photoshop that are built on Firefly. So in terms of staying ahead, it also comes back to focus, right? Like if you're trying to do something, especially if you're catching up in a new area, you can't try to win on every single dimension. So like where do you have something that is truly differentiated? I mean, with Express right now, I mean, I think we are pushing hard on, the collaboration between creative professionals and visual communicators. That's something that, Adobe can enable. We're also investing a lot in the partner ecosystem that, my team is enabling. And that's something that we have a lot of existing partnerships in the industry. And so those connections and integrations are something that we can showcase with Express.
That's awesome. I like my closing thoughts, and I'll give you the chance to add any that you have, but I want to combine two things that you said. Like, one thing I always loved at Adobe is it's never left its identity. So like, it took a long time to figure out how Omniture actually fit into Adobe's ecosystem, but it's always been creative at its roots. It's always never abandoned its customers. And that's how it's always led with innovation. So I think to your point, like the future and competing is really not going away from who you are, your core competencies.
Yeah.
And you're going to win with your strengths more than your weaknesses. And I feel like that's how Adobe's always kind of been. And that's my closing thoughts from our conversation.
Yeah. I think it's spot on. I mean, I've been fortunate to spend the bulk of my career at two of the largest design software companies in the world, Autodesk and Adobe. And it's, building products for creatives, right? Working at that intersection of design and technology it's such a fun customer problem space to be part of. And I think it's part of what makes Adobe such a special place. I mean, that kind of creative and innovative DNA, because you're ultimately building products for creative and innovative people. It's just it helps us attract some of the best and the brightest and the most passionate people that you could ever want to work with. And I think it really sustains a lot of us. I mean, I'm coming up on 10 years and I still feel like a short timer at Adobe. And that doesn't, I think an outsider would be like, it's stodgy and they don't know how to move quickly. But, if you look at the last couple of years, I mean, we've got some of the most incredible innovations in Adobe's entire history. I mean, certainly Adobe Firefly and what we're doing with generative AI, but even our core products like, Photoshop, and which continues to reinvent itself, Acrobat, and new products like Express. I mean, I think it's a great time to be at Adobe. And that's just on the digital media side. We also have the whole digital marketing side of the house, that you worked for. But, when you think about creating end-to-end experiences, it's the magic of Adobe all together that, helps companies just build their whole digital experience, their whole footprint. And I still enjoy it. I'm still having a good time.
Epic conversation as always, my friend. Thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Joe. Let's do it again soon.